It seems like I need to get on them preacher people to get done earlier so we can start class on time. Welcome to our Exodus class. Again, if you're joining us here in the auditorium or over the web, we are going to be discussing our 21st class here, talking about some of the instructions that happened then after the covenant. So if we are staying on schedule here, should be. Well, that ain't gonna work. There we go. So staying on schedule here, the plan for today was to cover all the way up to chapter 29. I do not believe I will get that far. In fact, I won't. We will stop at the end of chapter 28, assuming we even make it quite that far. And Jay has already graciously agreed. I just bugged him this morning and said, I don't think I'm going to get to 29. You want to tack it onto your Wednesday class? And he agreed to go ahead and add that there. So chapter 29 talks about instructions for sanctifying the priests and preparing them, so we won't quite get to that today. Instead, we will stay with some of the portions of the tabernacle and some things to do with the priests. What we covered on Wednesday, just as a quick review here, this idea that after the giving of the law and after the giving of all of those commandments that we had, which seemed a little bit onerous, and some people may even think, we're harsh, there was a lot of capital punishment there, yet at the same time we do see that God turned right around and offered them this carrot. It's not going to be just about I'm forcing you to obey just because I can. Instead, he's trying to give them some very positive reasons to obey and to go ahead and celebrate entering into this covenant relationship with them. So he promised that he would reward them with the land of Canaan. He would send a messenger along with them to lead and protect them, that while they were there, they wouldn't be sick, they wouldn't be barren, there would be no miscarriages, and that they would live their full lives. They would live out their full long days there, it says. And that God would fight on their side against their enemies. And then even when it comes to giving them the land, he wasn't going to give them a land in a way that they weren't ready for. He was going to make sure that they possessed the land as they were ready for it, so that they would move into places where it hadn't come overgrown, and as the text literally says, the wild beasts won't multiply against you there. We did talk about this idea of who is God sending with them. Here it's called an angel, and not to harp on this topic, it's kind of become a favorite of mine to kind of rail against lately, but really it's just the word messenger there that our translators have chosen to use the word angel. So a messenger of God who is to be obeyed. He speaks with God's voice. They're told not to rebel against him. Literally it says, my name is in him, which a better translation of that would be, he has my name, or he has the same name as me. Of course, we talked just briefly about how many do believe this to be a pre-incarnate Jesus, meaning that element of the Godhead who is Jesus, but before he became what we know as Yeshua, the son of Mary there. And then at the end of that, he does warn them, actually about middle and then at the very end of that passage, he warns them twice about the inhabitants of the land, telling them when you move into the land and when you possess it, kick them out completely. Don't let them stay there with you. Don't let them influence you. And not just the people of the land, but also about their gods. Because if you let the people stay there, both the people are going to try to convince you to worship their gods, and for some reason their gods are going to be a snare for you, which will make the people sin against him, as he said there. We then went through the covenant and talked about how it was one of the key passages of the Old Testament, really because it was the first mutual covenant, contract that put both requirements on both God and man there. Both parties agree to this. This is the first time that God enters into a relationship where he requires the person who he's entered, or the people he's entering into this relationship with, to agree 100% and say, yes, we will do this. And of course, it is full of conditional promises. There's the whole aspect which Exodus doesn't give us, but we find in Leviticus and also again in Deuteronomy, which are just retellings of the same kind of thing, where it is this whole idea of the blessings and cursings you've heard of before. If you behave, you get all these blessings. If you don't behave, you get all these curses. Okay, so that conditional promises were there. So what all happened there at the base of Mount Sinai then? In order for the covenant to be complete, the arrangements were made of the two parties coming together, how we're going to come together, who's going to represent who, and everybody agreed to that, just like any kind of treaty we would. The paperwork was completed. Remember, Moses wrote everything that God had said down in this, what later becomes the law. It was called here the Book of Testimony, also called the Book of the Covenant. He prepares that. The setting was prepared with the altar to represent God and the 12 memorial stones to represent the individual tribes. Also, the preparation of getting who's going to come, which was kind of part of the arrangements, but we're going to have Moses and Aaron, and then Aaron's two sons, and then 70 elders are going to come as part of that. They make the sacrifice. It's not just a single sacrifice, but many sacrifices, at least one from every tribe, perhaps even multiple within each family unit within those tribes. We're not really sure. Both parties are sealed in blood. The blood is applied to the altar, sealing God into this arrangement. Then the blood is applied to the people, sealing the people into this arrangement. Basically the same thing we would say is signing. So both parties sign in blood. They agree we will do this. And then afterwards there is this great celebration feast hosted by God partway up the mountain that the 70 elders, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu go to, and Joshua apparently went also up to this celebration feast where they actually sit and talk with God. And the scripture says, and they saw God there. So the covenant is complete and everything is ready to go. Moses, then we kind of really quickly wrapped up the end of that chapter on Wednesday. God calls Moses farther up the mountain where he says, I'm going to give you more instruction, which is what we're going to be covering here, the more instruction. And also I'm going to give you some of this on tablets of stone. We do believe that it was just the 10 Commandments, which is what was there, but we don't know for sure. Everybody kind of thinks that, but we don't know exactly for sure what was contained on those tablets. So Moses goes up, takes Joshua with them, leaves Aaron and Hur in charge. So remember, while we are studying this and seeing the further details that God is giving to Moses, that Aaron and Hur are down leading the people, should be able to lead them very confidently and competently, but yet we are going to see that they don't. So there's 40 days that Moses is up there, and during those days, things kind of very quickly descend into chaos down below. But anyway, Moses does as God says, walks partway up the mountain with Joshua. He's told to wait there for 6 days, where the glory of the Lord comes and again takes complete possession of the top of the mountain in the form of a cloud. And for 6 days, God is doing something there at the top of the mountain to prepare for Moses. We're not exactly sure what. But then on the 7th day, after his work, again, that 6 days of work being symbolized there, whenever God is ready for Moses to come up, on the 7th day, then he calls him all the way up to the peak, or at least higher. Moses goes up. As soon as Moses enters the cloud changes in how it is viewed from down below. No longer is it just seen as a cloud. Now it is seen like the entire top of the mountain is on fire while Moses is up there. There's a lot of representation we could talk about there. And then, of course, Moses and Joshua do stay there for 40 days. Okay? Just a quick catch up in case you were not able to listen in to the class on Wednesday night. So we're going to begin then in Exodus chapter 25, and I don't plan on reading a ton of this chapter today. In fact, we may finish class a little bit earlier today since I went over almost a full 10 minutes on Wednesday, and just give more time for the swap over between this service and and the next here. But at the beginning of chapter 25, God makes this call out to the people, because now if we're going to build this tabernacle and we're going to build all of these elements that are going to be required to be inside of the tabernacle, we need a bunch of building material in order to make this happen. So they're going to take up a collection here. God asks for contribution. This is kind of interesting because he's not telling them, here's your tithe. It really is just, if you want to help out with this, please give. It's voluntary, at least as far as from God's standpoint. Now, there is some rabbinical, if you read some rabbinical writing, there's some tradition that Moses and Aaron had some really tough guys going around with those people who were asking for donations, and nobody didn't give something, but that's not what the scripture says here. And it says, from every man whose heart moves him. So whatever they were feeling moved to contribute in thanks to God, whatever they were wanting to go ahead and give as part of this effort as they're becoming a nation, that's what they were going to be asked to give. And there were some very specific materials that God said we need to gather up. From the metal side, he needed gold and silver and bronze or copper, bronze being a combination of copper and tin there. And some people, in some translations, will even call it copper there. All kinds of yarn and linen and animal skins and animal hair were to be gathered up. A bunch of oil and different kinds of spices there. And even some very specific types of gemstones were called out as God was wanting the people to gather and to bring together. Then, once we leave that, we start to get into this section here. In Exodus chapter 25 through 40, we're going to see these instructions on how to basically build everything that is going to need for them to have a government and them to have a religion. Because remember, the tabernacle, which we think of as the center of their worship, which it was also the center of their government. It's where Moses and the priests did their work, mostly the priests, but Moses also from there. We're going to have the tent of meeting, which is set up just outside of the tabernacle. It's the place where the people come to get judgment. So this is the entire center of the Israelite world while they are traveling to the promised land. It's going to stay that way, of course, we know. The story hasn't happened yet, but we know that they're going to not move into Canaan when God wanted them to, and they're going to wander for 40 years. But those entire 40 years, this is going to be the center of their world. Now, before we start talking about some of these details, I wanted to make, and we'll talk just because it's me, I will make a whole bunch of general comments here. First and foremost, there are a lot of details. There are a lot of details that we're not going to be reading. It's great reading on your own if you want to sit down and read these, specifically the 4 chapters that we would be today, 25, 26, 27, 28. You can read them. They're very quick reading. Doesn't take a lot of brain power to read through some of this stuff. You can just read it and absorb exactly what it says on the very surface level. There's, especially in this rendition, this is just straight out instructions. But still, not everything is covered. There's still a lot more that goes on behind the scenes than Moses chose to write down. There are some very detailed plans laid out, but yet the plans that we have recorded are somewhat generic. He just says, build a box this size. Not necessarily describing in intricate detail what the decorations were supposed to look like. When he talks about the cherubim, right? The mercy seat was going to contain these 2 cherubim that face each other, and their wings were going to cover over the top. What does a cherubim look like? How did Moses know what the cherubim was supposed to look like? Well, there's some very interesting parts here. God provides a ton more detail to Moses and to others, we find out in these passages, than what Moses chose to write down. In fact, we say today this idea of picture is worth 1,000 words. As an engineer, I'm not going to put together this great textual list of instructions of how to tell you to build something. I'm going to give you a blueprint that tells you exactly what to do and exactly what it's supposed to look like at the end. That's exactly what God does with Moses and with some of the other people here. Several times throughout here, and we're going to read just a couple passages here, it will specifically call out that God showed them what it was supposed to look like. He actually imprinted in their mind or somehow made it appear on a cloud or however he did it. He showed them exactly how he wanted it to be. So there was going to be no question. Let's just look at a couple of those passages here. Exodus chapter 25 and verse 9. Exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, so you shall make it. The description we have written down is nowhere near enough to be exactly as shown. So Moses was given some picture of what this is supposed to look like. And then when it comes to the people who are actually building it, and there's a couple passages in some of the scriptures that other people are going to cover that I don't want to walk all over, but Exodus 29 is a great example. Exodus 31. But if you look at Exodus 28 here, you shall speak to all the skillful whom I have filled with the spirit of skill, that they make Aaron's garments to consecrate him for my priesthood. So chapter 28 is going to specifically list out what the garments are supposed to look like. And as we'll see, I'll show you several different pictures of people reading that description, and they come up with vastly different looks because the detail provided for us is not enough to get it exact. So what God did was gave Moses a picture, and then whenever the people were picked in order to build it, it says God actually filled them with the spirit of skill to make it exactly how he wanted. I believe this is very similar to, and I think I even have this point later on, this is very similar to what we would talk about a prophet. A prophet who is going to deliver the exact words as God wanted him to deliver it, God working through that prophet to get his message done. But in this case, God is going to work through these skilled tradesmen, whether it's the people who are making the garments or the people who are fashioning the gold or the people who are building the wood. He's going to work through them to make sure that they make it exactly how he wants it there. Okay? Because of that, here's the point. Very special knowledge and abilities were given to people. I mean, if you think about it, just within the last couple months, these people were slaves. And they were slaves who were primarily doing what? These massive construction projects, right? They were making clay, they were making bricks, they were hauling loads. How many of them do you think were detailed goldsmiths? Probably none, to be honest. There may have been some who learned that trade depending on who they were slaves to, but the Egyptians would never have trusted them, especially in the latter years. The Egyptians would never have entrusted them with that kind of task when they were already so suspicious of them and trying to beat them down. But now all of a sudden you're going to have in this group of people who can make these extremely intricate gold and copper, and they can somehow work the wood and overlay it and do all of this kind of wrapping of the wood with the different metals. That's a very specialized skill. God says, I'm going to give them that ability. Again, we've talked about this a little bit, but we also have no idea what these things really looked like. The descriptions we have are not nearly detailed enough. Just one very simple example is the horns on the altar. Exodus chapter 27 and verse 2 says, and you shall make horns for it on its four corners, and its horns shall be of one piece with it, and you shall overlay it with bronze. What did the horns look like? If you look at 20 different drawings, 20 different rebuilds of that altar, you are going to see 20 different interpretations of what those horns look like. You may see some from just the pointy part of that corner coming up. That would have been considered a horn of that. You may see even some believe that it came up and there was a cup built into that horn where blood could be held. Instead of just touching the blood, where they would have poured a little blood into that cup there. Some people believe it was some kind of ram's horn, all curled and squirreling out of those corners. But we don't know. It just says a horn. So anybody who tells you they know what the Ark of the Covenant looked like, they know what the Temple of Showbread looked like, they're wrong. They don't, okay? Know exactly what it looked like anyway. An interesting point, if you read through here, especially if you pre-read based on the schedule, you probably got tired of seeing the word cubit. Almost all of the dimensions are given in cubits. Well, we don't really know what a cubit is today. When we would talk about how we measure things, we would go grab a tape measure, okay, or a measuring laser, or some other kind of very precise measuring instrument. Back then, that wasn't always the case. So a cubit is the length from elbow to fingertip, okay? That's what a cubit is. All of their measurements were basically taken off of body parts. When you talk about the idea of a cubit or even a foot, it's the length of a foot. A hand would have been just the length of the hand. A span would have been the widest part of the fingers. A fathom, that's a fathom, okay? How far your arms are apart. All of these measurements are taken basically someone who could walk up and do that. Obviously, though, this is different from person to person. I measured mine last night when I was preparing, just put my elbow on the desk. Mine is 19.25 inches. So if I build a cubit versus somebody, if I build something to 2 cubits, I'm going to make it to, 38.5 inches? But if somebody else with shorter or longer arms makes that, Michael Jordan, for example, had freakishly long arms even for his height, it's going to be maybe twice as big as mine, okay, based on the same measurement. Typically today, we assume, just based on what we know about the height of these people in general, people are generally taller than now. I'm 6 foot, not particularly tall these days, but I would have been very tall probably in these times when we talk about the people in the Middle East and the children of Israel as they came out of Egypt. Average height was probably 5'8" or 5'9" for a male. So it's taken as pretty much standard that 18 inches is what is meant by a cubit. So 2 cubits would be 3 feet, okay? Now, there is also, you will see in some literature, and we have found some things. In fact, the earliest one goes back to, I couldn't find a good picture of it. There's some drawings of it, but I couldn't find a good picture of it. But they have found in Egypt a bar that was called a royal cubit. And it was made from one of the emperors or the pharaohs of Egypt. They measured his arm, and they made an iron bar that was that long, and they made a bunch of them. And that became a standard royal cubit, okay? Which is probably a lot based on what this is, them just having come out of 300 plus years of slavery in Egypt. Almost everything we're going to see here, if you read through this, is made of acacia wood. The question often comes up, is acacia wood some kind of special wood? Is it ever holy, somehow special to God because he asked for all these elements to be made of that? No, we're not told that acacia wood is any kind of special. Likely, it's the only kind of wood that they could get in any kind of quantity, okay? Acacia wood would grow there in the desert, and we'll see some pictures of what acacia tree looks like in just a second here. They take that acacia then and they wrap it in gold or copper. Gold for anything that is inside, either the holy place or the most holy place, so inside the tabernacle proper, and then copper or bronze for anything that is out in the courtyard. Almost everything, because remember, the tabernacle is basically a tent, and these people are wandering, right? So almost everything is carried on poles. Special rings are called out in the description to hold the poles. Sometimes, like in the Ark of the Covenant, the poles are supposed to stay there all the time. Sometimes the poles are only used to carry it. The table of showbread, for example, the poles were inserted every time in order to carry it from place to place. But when it was set up inside the reassembled tent, then they would pull those poles out and lay them aside. But the poles for the Ark of the Covenant never left the Ark. They always stayed in. Just quickly, some pictures here. This is acacia wood, and I think my animations are off here. Very beautiful if it's done properly. Yeah, this is not working out real well. Let me fix that quick. Let's try this. So there's an acacia tree of what it would have looked like in the middle of the wilderness there, okay? Here's another picture of a bunch of them out there with camels, and you can kind of see there, just as it would go in the background, these are pictures that they're pretty sparse, right? Remember, this is still a desert area, but yet there is a kind of tree that would have been very prevalent as they were making their way through here. So it really just has to do with acacia wood is what they had, all right? Just as another comment, there are duplicate passages of almost all of this. Some here in Exodus, we'll see that there's some descriptions of how it's supposed to be built. And when we get to later chapters, there's another 2 or 3 chapters dedicated to just how they built it, which, by the way, guess what? They built it in the same way that we're going to read God told them to build it. Okay, so it's almost an exact duplicate of that. Some places in Deuteronomy, you will see this repeated with a few more details added here and there. Almost all of it is completely repeated in the book of Leviticus somewhere, as just the definitions of what was going to happen. It looks like if you just read the book of Leviticus and the book of Exodus, it's almost like the same guy makes 2 arks of the covenant. You have to remember that they're just duplicate passages there, okay? Also, something interesting to note, these are the pattern for the elements that are going to be in the temple. These same elements will be put into the temple of David, and then I guess the temple of Solomon, technically. The table that David prepares all the stuff for that temple, and then the temple of the Herods. All of this stuff is going to be carried down. Some of them are going to be the exact same. There's one specific thing that stays the exact same. We assume repairs are made and things like that unless God completely protects it, which would be what? The Ark of the Covenant, right? It's the original Ark that they make here that makes it all the way down through, we don't really know for sure when it was lost, but makes it all the way down through the time that it's lost, okay? Some are remakes. The showbread, for example. We know at least once the showbread is completely melted down and taken at the table of showbread, is completely melted down and taken as spoils off into captivity. Okay, so when you find the table of showbread later, it's a remake of what's going to happen here. Now, as we go into this, we don't have a ton of time left, only about 14 minutes, which we'll use up here, but I just want to let you know that I'm going to barely scratch the surface of what you can study about this stuff. There are a ton of resources online. We live in a fantastic age. If you want to find information and details about these things, there's tons of pictures, videos. I'm actually going to play a couple of videos here quickly just to give you a brief sample of what that might look like. I would make one recommendation if you want to look at somebody. There is a guy called the Tabernacle Man. If you go to tabernacleman.com or his YouTube channel, the Tabernacle Man, the videos are now a little bit older. I believe the videos were made in the late 80s or in the 90s. On YouTube, they've been posted there for 15 years now, pretty much since YouTube was really first a big thing. And it's a Jewish man who has gone back, a rabbi who's a Christian, who has gone back and done some very wonderful videos. We'll look at one of his here briefly here. And he does a fantastic job of describing these things and going through. If you really want to see some good descriptions of how these items were built and what they would have looked like and what they were used for, I would highly recommend you look at his stuff. He also has some things I haven't watched in full detail, but the things I've seen have been really good, of describing how they carry forward into Christ and what these elements were meant to represent from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's really some very good stuff there. So let's go ahead then and talk about some of these. The first one that is mentioned in Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 through 22 here is the Ark of the Covenant, also called the Ark of the Testimony. God specifically says that he's going to provide testimony to put inside. We're not told what it is here. You have to look in Leviticus and then again in Deuteronomy to see what elements were placed into the Ark of the Covenant. Some key elements here. It was roughly 45 inches by 27 by 27, so 4 foot by 2 plus tall. There were 2 cherubim that sat on top facing each other that formed the mercy seat. This would represent where God would come to be among them, and it says that he would speak to them from between the cherubims there on the mercy seat. It doesn't say he actually came and sat there, but that his presence would reside between those two cherubim. Again, if you want to talk about just how radically different you can get here, here's some pictures. This is one artist's representation, which I'm going to tell you is wrong because the poles are in the wrong place. You'll see a lot of people, in fact, almost all of these, they put the poles on the front and the back. The poles were supposed to be on the side. People do that because it would have been easier to carry with the poles on the length, the widest dimension there. But they were really supposed to be on the side, not the front or the back. The poles were not supposed to be a barrier to God, is what the whole meaning of that is. Here's another representation of what it would look like with the poles in the correct place. This artist put the poles down at the bottom versus this artist put the poles at the top. Now, just as an example of what is possible here, I'm going to try to do this. All right, so this is a video that someone put together. You guys ready back there? It's going to read the scripture and show you the Ark of the Covenant kind of being built according to the definitions of scripture here.
Two and a half cubits shall be its length, a cubit and a half its width,
Here, I'll start
and a cubit and a half its height.
All right, here we go.
And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, a cubit and a half its width, and a cubit and a half its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and out you shall overlay it, and shall make on it a moulding of gold all around. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in its 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side, and 2 rings on the other side. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, that the ark may be carried by them. The poles shall be in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony which I will give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and a cubit and a half its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, of hammered work you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end, and the other cherub at the other end, and you shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of it one piece with the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel.
All right, so that's just a sample of the quality of material that you can easily find for free out there. I think that video does a fantastic job of actually walking through the reading of Scripture and showing you what that might have looked like. But again, we don't know. When it said make a molding of gold, if you just went to Home Depot, how many different kinds of molding are there? Thousands. So what did it look like? What was the exact shape of it? We don't know. Moses knew, and the craftsmen who were required to make it were given that vision so that they would know and it would be made exactly like God wanted it to be. Okay, let me jump back over here real quick. Oops. All right, the next element that it mentions here is the table for the bread. The table was for bread and drink elements. It's also called the table of showbread. The bread of presence here is what it's called in right here in this passage in Exodus. Some key elements of that. It was roughly 36 inches by 18 inches by 27 inches, 2 by 1 by 1.5 tall. That is just the tabletop portion, okay? So it was supposed to be a little over 2 foot tall, just the top. That does not include the legs, okay? Also had a bunch of different utensils that are called out here. He says, make plates, make dishes, make bowls, make flagons, all of these kind of things. Well, what were they supposed to look like? There's no way that could be described here. So God had to give them what it was supposed to look like. Again, just as some examples of how wildly different we might interpret that, here's one, I think, a very good representation of what the showbread might have looked like with the table and the poles there, which again, those poles would have been removed when it was in the ark. The flagons and the different pouring for the drink offerings that could be made. There was a bowl that was supposed to hold incense, that incense was going to be burned. Some people interpret the loaves were stacked on trays like this. It's an equally valid interpretation of the text as we have it. Again, because we just don't know exactly what it looked like. The lampstand is next, and some of this is a little boring here, I apologize, but the lampstand is listed. It's the only light in the tabernacle itself. It would have been the only light other than the presence of God, which was viewed as light sometimes. But the light was from this lampstand was it, okay? Some key elements. There were 7 total lamps, 1 in the center, and then 6 on the sides, 3 pairs on each side. It was made of roughly 75 pounds of gold, so extremely heavy. A full talent was to be used in making this stand. And even though we're given some descriptions of it's supposed to look like a certain kind of flower and the cup of that, again, exactly what that looked like we don't know. Here's a couple artists' renditions. This one has it based on some kind of pillar. We're not told here that they were supposed to move a stone or something to raise it up, but yet many people think that it was short and held on some other kind of table or something to hold it up here. Here's another description of that. With this one, I think does a really good job of, if you look at there, the showing that those were really supposed to look more like flowers there. Those 3 places on each side were supposed to really look like a flower there. I thought that graphic did a good job of that. And then many people also think, which I tend to believe this is probably the case, because we're not told it was intended to sit on something, but in order for it to light the inside of the holy place, which is what it was supposed to do, God says even position the lamp so that they will light the inside. It must have sat up on some kind of taller stand, would have been part of it, okay? I believe this probably to be a more accurate representation of what that would have looked like. We do find here some descriptions of the tabernacle. It's made up of 2 parts we see listed here. We'll talk about them both together. The tabernacle proper, which is the tent itself, and then the tabernacle court, which are going to be the walls that go outside of that. So of the tabernacle proper, it was roughly 30 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet tall. So not small, but not, incredibly huge as buildings go, as tents go. A 30-foot by 15-foot tent is pretty big. It's made up of all kind of different curtains of linen and yard, and they were supposed to be placed, and 10 curtains were going to make up the primary portion, and 5 were together, and 5 were together on the other side, and then you had 7 on the front, and a lot of detail we see here. They were to make a covering of goat hair to lay over top of all of those curtains to protect it. Okay, that was more like what we would call a rain flap that would go over it, more water resistant in case it rained or bad weather came. And it had 2 sections, the holy place and the most holy place. So the first section you would enter into was called the holy place, and the second was called the most holy. The court included the outside walls. Those walls were also made of different curtains and different they were made of cloth of different kinds. The walls were 7.5 feet tall. The outside dimensions of that were 150 feet in depth, because you actually looked at it face on, 150 feet by 75 feet wide. There was a 30-foot wide opening. It's called the gate, but it was really just a curtain that would open, but it's the gate into the the courtyard on one end. It was supposed to be 30 foot wide. Here is a drawing I put together years ago of the tabernacle. This is, to my best of knowledge, to scale, at least as far as the lengths of the different pieces here. So you had the outside court, and then inside that, the altar of burnt offerings, the laver, showbread, and the altar of incense and the lampstand inside the holy place, and then across a veil, only the ark, the actual mercy seat where God would join them, would be in the most holy of holies along the back wall where God would actually come. Here's a couple representations of that. This one's good. This one is one that was built here in the U.S., actually, by a teen group. They were having this big teen thing for actually the Church of Latter-day Saints. They were having this big event, and they built a life-size one. Actually, it was built very, very well here. And in fact, we will switch over here, and let me show you this. So this is the one video that I will show you from the guy, the Tabernacle Man. You can look up his channel if you so want. But this is just describing the outer court, again, going through Scripture as he describes it. I think it's very well done.
And thou shalt make the court of the tabernacle. For the south side southward there shall be hangings for the court of fine twined linen, 100 cubits long for one side. And the pillars thereof shall be 20, and their sockets 20, of copper. The hooks of the pillars and their fillets shall be of silver. And likewise for the north side in length there shall be hangings 100 cubits long, and the pillars thereof 20, and their sockets 20, of copper, the hooks of the pillars and their fillets of silver. And for the breadth of the court on the west side shall be hangings of 50 cubits, their pillars 10, and their sockets 10. And the breadth of the court on the east side eastward shall be 50 cubits. The hangings for the one side of the gate shall be 15 cubits, their pillars 3, and their sockets 3. And for the other side shall be hangings of 15 cubits, their pillars 3, and their sockets 3. And for the gate of the court shall be a screen of 20 cubits, of blue, and purple, and scarlet, and fine twined linen, the work of the weaver in colors, their pillars 4, and their sockets 4. All the pillars of the court round about shall be filleted with silver, their hooks of silver, and their sockets of copper. The length of the court shall be 100 cubits, and the breadth 50 everywhere, and the height 5 cubits, of fine twined linen, and their sockets of copper. All the instruments of the tabernacle, and all the service thereof, and all the pins thereof, and all the pins of the court shall be of copper. Exodus chapter 27, verses 9 through 19.
So again, just way more than I could ever present. And there is, I was intending to play this video, but we're already out of time here. This is a video of that one, and we don't need sound for this one. There's no reading. This is just a drone fly-through of the entire tabernacle that they built here. Again, to scale, shows the different colors, which aspects were supposed to be. I mean, obviously looks a little bit different because we don't know exactly what the pillars looked like, how wide they were, those kind of things, what's supposed to be inside. They actually go through each of the elements. The horns in this one were very pronounced, okay? Again, we don't know exactly what it's supposed to look like, but they'll go inside. There's the bronze, the lampstand, and they did a really good job, actually, of making this out. And if you want to get the link to this, just let me know, and I'll send it to you. Just some absolutely beautiful material that has been written out there for us to look at and learn from. Okay, real quickly to finish up my section here, the altar, this is going to be the primary altar for the nation. It's the only altar that's not supposed to be made of stone, of earth here. Some key elements, it was 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet square, 4.5 feet tall. Basically, it's really a big grill. Okay, it's a wooden box with a copper or bronze grate put partway down inside of that. The fire would then be underneath that, and you would throw the burnt offering up on top of that grate. I mean, it acted just like a grill, okay? They also had a bunch of utensils that were supposed to be made, forks, shovels, ash pots, the basins to carry stuff back and forth, the flesh hooks and the different hooks to move things around. There's a whole bunch of utensils listed there. Here's just another couple pictures of what people have rendered that to look like. And again, just even those horns might have looked much differently. This one just shows them as corners. This one shows them as more kind of horn looking, granting out. And then quickly, if you'll give me another 2 minutes, the priest's garments were supposed to be made. It's interesting here, out of all the attention that God is calling to the place, this is the one thing that these were truly meant to impress. Exodus chapter 28 and verse 2, it says, "You shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother for glory and for beauty." These garments were supposed to be glorious. They were supposed to be beautiful, showing that Aaron and the priests were special, that they were representing the people to God, but also God to the people. Some of the key elements here, it had these main components: a breastpiece, an ephod, which is kind of like the underlying part of that, the robe, underneath the breastpiece, I should say, the robe, a coat of checker work, a turban, and a sash. Just one more time, very different interpretations of what that might have looked like. Here's one that describes all of those elements, from the turban with the plate of gold that was supposed to actually be touching his head, down to the breastplate, and the ephod would have been this portion here underneath that, the embroidered sash, the checkered coat underneath, all the different details here. But again, same description, looks radically different, but yet contains all of the same elements here. In one of the things, you can actually see where they made a wax statue, but again, looks completely different, but contains all of the same elements and is scripturally accurate here, because we just don't know what they looked like. All right, so that wraps up, actually, my portion here. Jay will be taking over on Wednesday, picking up there in chapter 29. And actually that, according to the schedule, which always subject to change, but that wraps up my portion of teaching this class until the very last class, where I will do an overview there, unless one of the other guys wants to give me some of their subject material. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm sorry some of this was dry, but the material is what the material is. Thank you. Well, thank you. Well, thank you.